The stories found in the ancient scriptures collected into what we call the Bible are not literal or historical. They can be shown to be based on celestial metaphor, with the figures and the events based on specific constellations and heavenly features, including the Milky Way. In fact, this system of celestial metaphor is extremely ancient and can be shown to be the foundation of the world's ancient myths from cultures around the globe, including the myths of ancient Egypt and of ancient Mesopotamia and of ancient India and of ancient China and Japan and of ancient Greece and of the Norse myths and of the sacred stories found in cultures in Africa and in Australia and in the Americas and in the cultures of the Pacific. The evidence to support this conclusion that the world's ancient myths are all built upon a common system of celestial metaphor is simply overwhelming. I have written books totaling over 5,000 pages so far, containing hundreds of illustrations, exploring just some of the evidence, and I've made several dozen videos also detailing some of this evidence, not to mention publishing over 1,300 blog posts, which you can find on my website, and they're fully searchable. And even with that, I've still only barely scratched the surface of what could be shown as proof of the existence of this ancient system of metaphor. The fact that the stories in the Bible, in common with the rest of the world's ancient myths and sacred stories, are built on a foundation of stars and metaphor does not mean that they're not true. They contain profound truth, just as the ancient myths given to all cultures around the world contain profound truth. Studying the biblical scriptures and their lessons for our lives is absolutely valuable, and I'm convinced that they are trying to tell us something very powerful. They have a very positive message which applies to each and every one of us right where we are. The same is equally true for the ancient wisdom found in the Odyssey of ancient Greece and in the Mahabharata of ancient India and in all the other myths given to the cultures of the world as a precious inheritance for humanity. But I'm also convinced that the fact that the stories can be shown to be based on celestial metaphor indicates that they are not describing events from literal terrestrial human history. That fact does not in any way diminish the power and the profundity of their message. You do not lose any of the lessons from the Odyssey by understanding that it is not based on terrestrial, literal, historical events. You do not lose any of the lessons from the story of Samson or the story of Tobit when you understand that they are metaphor. But when we realize that these stories, in common with the ancient myths of all other cultures of the world, are built on the very same system of metaphor, then we see quite clearly that literalist teachings of having exclusive claim to the truth and literalist campaigns to convert people from their original inherited sacred traditions to faith in a literalistic interpretation of the biblical scriptures are deeply misguided and in error. Recently, I received a message via social media from an insightful individual who asked if I had ever considered the figure of Saint Christopher and whether the story of Saint Christopher could have anything to do with carrying the sun across the Milky Way, and perhaps also something to do with the star Sirius. So I decided to look a little more closely into the story of Saint Christopher. I've previously written about the legend of Saint Laurentius, or Saint Lawrence, in my 2018 book, Star Myths of the World, Volume 4, Norse Mythology, in conjunction with some of the discussion of the death of Balder and the funeral pyre in which Balder is burned. And I point out in that book that we find a similar pattern in the death of the hero Heracles or Hercules in the myths of ancient Greece and Rome, as well as in the legends of the martyrdom of Saint Laurentius. And I show that this particular myth pattern is almost certainly based on the stars. And as it turns out, the stories about Saint Christopher also appear to be based on celestial metaphor rather than on any literal terrestrial historical events. In fact, the Catholic Church actually removed Saint Christopher from their calendar of feasts commemorating the saints in 1969-1970 period. Some say over doubts regarding the historicity of the life of Saint Christopher, but that has not diminished his popularity, and it's actually kind of a convenient example of the fact that there really is no urgent need to demand that everyone take these stories as literal terrestrial history in order to get value from what these stories have to tell us and to teach us. So in the story of St. Christopher, we read that Christopher was a very tall man, indeed, according to many accounts and traditions, a giant or even an ogre, and that he started out with a different name. According to most traditions, he was named REPROBUS, which is based on the Latin word for disapproval, the verb probare, meaning to approve of something or someone, and so the prefix re means to reverse or withdraw. So reprobate or reproval means the withdrawal of approval or the denial of approval. But some other sources seem to list his original name as OFFERUS. So anyway, according to the legend, this giant was so proud of his strength and his size and his power that he vowed to serve only the strongest king that he could find. But he discovered that the first king that he chose to serve was actually afraid of the devil. And so the giant went off to follow the devil instead, until he discovered that the devil was actually afraid of the sign of the cross. At which point, REPROBUS, or OFFERUS, decided to follow Christ. Finding a hermit who could teach him Christian doctrine, the giant wondered how he could best serve Christ, and ultimately decided, with the hermit's approval, that due to his great size and strength, he was ideally suited to helping travelers cross a strong and swift-moving river by carrying them on his shoulders. And so this calling he dutifully performed until one day, in the most famous part of the Christopher story, he helped a young child cross the river. And as he got to the middle of the stream, he found that the child was becoming heavier and heavier, in fact so heavy that it was almost impossible for the giant. It was all that the giant could do to hold him up, steadying himself in the river with his gigantic staff. He had a huge staff that he used as he was crossing the river. So it was all he could do to get across. And so when he got to the other side, the child informed him that the reason he had felt so heavy was that the child himself was carrying the weight of the world's sins. So the giant immediately realized this is a manifestation of the Christ in the form of a child, even though, according to the legend, REPROBUS or OFFERUS lived and died during the 3rd century AD, long after the supposed time that Christ would have been an adult. So, also according to some versions of the legend, when the giant finally reached the far side of the river, he planted his staff in the ground, and it immediately began to grow leaves and bear fruit, a miraculous sign which we do find in other myths as well. But it convinced the giant that the child was in fact divine, and caused REPROBUS to go throughout the land and started to go around telling others about his story and spreading the gospel. So he was given the name Christopher, which means the Christ bearer, because of this event of carrying the Christ child across the river. So later, according to the story, Christopher was martyred when he was commanded to make a sacrifice to the emperor, and he refused. And according to some versions of the story, he was thrown in prison, and in an attempt to compromise him and get him to betray his principles, two harlots or prostitutes were sent in to Christopher in order to try and seduce him, to try and show, oh, you won't give a sacrifice to the emperor because you're so devoted to Christ, and they were going to try and compromise him by sending in two prostitutes to seduce him. But according to the legend, Christopher instead converted them through his strong faith, and so, having failed to make any headway with Christopher, his head was chopped off by the Romans at the command of the emperor. So those who've spent any amount of time watching, looking through my books, blog posts, and videos may already have some thoughts about the likely celestial foundations for this story. In fact, there is a constellation which frequently appears in the role of a giant, not only in myths from other cultures around the world, including the Norse myths, but also in the Bible accounts in which giants such as Goliath and also many other giants are described as carrying a spear that is as large as a weaver's beam. You can do a search on any online Bible resource for the term weaver's beam, and you can see how many giants are described as having a spear like a weaver's beam. And those are characteristics that are associated across cultures, across myths, from the Norse myths to the Greek myths and also the Bible stories, with a specific constellation, the constellation Ophiuchus, which I'm outlining here. That's Ophiuchus. Figures in myth associated with the constellation Ophiuchus are often envisioned as carrying a great spear or a great staff, or sometimes even two spears. And that's because the constellation itself consists of a central body, right here, and then two, quote, serpent halves on either side of the central body, which can be envisioned as a great serpent that Ophiuchus is carrying, but can also appear as many other objects in various myths, including as spears or as rods or as some type of a staff. And also that long rectangular body of the central body of Ophiuchus often appears as a great shield, or is envisioned as a great shield. It's like it goes down and almost covers, down to the knees of the figure of Ophiuchus. So a lot of times an Ophiuchus figure will have a shield, and in fact, St. Christopher is sometimes associated with having a great shield as well as a great staff. Now notice in this image of St. Christopher crossing the river with the Christ child that the giant is shown in between two trees and in an outline which basically matches the outline of the constellation Ophiuchus very closely. The constellation Ophiuchus is located alongside the glorious path of the Milky Way galaxy. In fact, located right at the widest and the brightest part of the Milky Way band. And Ophiuchus has 1 foot in the Milky Way and 1 foot out of it. Now, the Milky Way, for obvious reasons, is envisioned in various myths as a body of water, often as a river, sometimes as the edge of a sea, and sometimes this wide part is like a pool or a grotto, but in this case it's a river. In the story of Moses, when Moses leads the children of Israel across the Red Sea, Moses has a staff or a rod which he extends over the Red Sea, and then the sea parts to allow them to all cross on dry ground. And you can see this feature in the Milky Way itself. You can see where the Red Sea is parted right there. There's a dark rift that is a pathway across the Red Sea. And you can see that Ophiuchus, the constellation, which is also associated with the figure of Moses and his staff, appears to be holding out a rod or a staff pointing directly towards this pathway, the dark rift, across the Milky Way, which in that episode plays the role of the heavenly Red Sea. In the story of Christopher bearing the Christ child, the child is always portrayed on the other side of Christopher from the staff held by Christopher. So the child is almost always portrayed as being on the other side as the staff held by Christopher, which leads me to believe that the child that Christopher is bearing can most likely be identified with the arc-shaped constellation of the Northern Crown, also known as Corona Borealis, which is right above the other half of the serpent, the serpent half that has the head of the serpent of Ophiuchus. Now, it may seem strange to associate the Christ child with the constellation of the Northern Crown, Corona Borealis, but the Northern Crown can be shown to play the role of a baby in many, many ancient myths, including in the story of the Judgment of Solomon. I've made several videos and blog posts about that. That's found in the book of 1 Kings, as well as in the story of baby Maui, who is thrown into the sea foam and then rescued from the sea by his powerful grandfather, Tamanui. And there are many, many other myths in which Corona Borealis plays an infant or a baby. So the connection between the constellation Corona Borealis and a child almost certainly explains why in this story it is the Christ child that Christopher carries across the river. And then when Christopher reaches the other side and his staff bears a bunch of fruit, that represents the other serpent half of Ophiuchus, which is usually called the serpent head, but the half closest to the Milky Way being the tail. But the serpent's head plays the role of various types of fruit in many different myths, as I discuss in a few of my books, including playing the role of the pomegranate in the underworld, some of whose seeds Persephone eats in the myths of ancient Greece, as well as playing the role of a strawberry in one of the myths of the native nations of North America, in a related story about a journey to the underworld. So this second staff of Ophiuchus, the other half of the serpent on the other side of Ophiuchus, is likely the source of the part of the story in which Christopher reaches the other side and sees his staff miraculously sprout leaves and fruit. But there's another intriguing aspect to the traditions of St. Christopher, and that original note that I received makes mention of it. So that note was very perceptive to think about the St. Christopher story having to do with crossing the Milky Way. I don't really believe it's carrying the sun across the Milky Way, although the sun does go through the foot of Ophiuchus, but I believe it has to do with the constellations that I just laid out. But there's another intriguing aspect to the traditions of St. Christopher, and that original note I received also makes mention of that tradition, which is the fact that Christopher is specifically mentioned in some of the legend material as being accompanied by his dog, and in some iconography, including in Eastern Christian traditions, Christopher is depicted as having a dog's head. The note that I received suggested that this dog association of St. Christopher might have something to do with the star Sirius. And that's not a bad suggestion at all. Sirius is the brightest star in the constellation Canis Major, or Canis Major, the greater dog, or the big dog, which is a constellation which follows close behind the well-known figure of Orion, the constellation Orion. And Orion, of course, is another towering figure in the sky, and one which does sometimes appear as a giant in ancient myths around the world. However, we've seen some pretty strong clues which indicate to me an association of St. Christopher with the constellation Ophiuchus. So we should also look for possible dog figures near Ophiuchus. And in fact, we do find the constellation Lupus, the wolf, located just below the constellation Scorpio, and Scorpio is located immediately beneath the feet of Ophiuchus. So Lupus, the wolf, is pretty close to Ophiuchus, almost as close as the greater dog, Canis Major, is to Orion, although not as closely associated as Canis Major is with Orion. But as I've also shown in previous books, such as Star Myths of the World Volume 2, which discusses Greek mythology, the constellation Scorpio itself, somewhat surprisingly, does appear to play a dog in some myths, including playing the role of the three-headed dog Cerberus, or Kerberos, who guards the gates to the underworld and to the realm of the dead. So I wouldn't say there's enough clues to be completely confident or dogmatic about the dog associations in some of the details of the St. Christopher tradition, but we do know from the tradition that St. Christopher eventually is executed by beheading, which is in fact a fairly consistent pattern for Ophiuchus figures, especially when they're playing the role of a giant. For example, in the book of 1 Samuel, the giant Goliath has his head cut off by David. And the reason for this is that the constellation Hercules is located immediately above Ophiuchus and can be seen to be brandishing an enormous sword. And as I discuss in another book, Star Myths of the World, Volume 3, Star Myths of the Bible, David can be confidently identified with the constellation Hercules and Goliath with the constellation Ophiuchus. David can be confidently associated with the constellation Hercules and Goliath with Ophiuchus. And remember the detail of the legend in which two women are sent in to St. Christopher to try and seduce him? Notice that Ophiuchus is situated in between two constellations who play the role of beautiful women in many ancient myths. On one side we see the constellation Virgo, the Virgin, right here. And on the other side we see the constellation Sagiggarius, which for fairly obvious reasons will sometimes play a beautiful woman or a beautiful goddess. So they're flanking on either side of Ophiuchus, St. Christopher. Finally, it's perhaps notable that the day of commemoration for St. Christopher is 25 July, July 25th, in the Western Christian tradition, but in the Eastern tradition, the Eastern Christian tradition, the day of commemoration and veneration for Christopher, the feast of St. Christopher, is May the 9th. So depending on what century you're in, the constellation Ophiuchus is crossing its highest point in the sky around May the 9th. May the 9th is about when Ophiuchus is at its highest point in the sky. Now, over the millennia, the progress of the stars is delayed by the action of precession, but Ophiuchus is basically at its highest point around May the 9th here in the year 810, that is to say AD 810, or if you prefer 810 CE. But because it's such a big constellation, that highest point, it's like for centuries, are around 810. Ophiuchus is at its highest point around May the 9th. So these clues make it pretty clear to me that St. Christopher is almost certainly associated with the constellation Ophiuchus, and that the stories surrounding his life are based on celestial metaphor rather than on literal terrestrial historical events. And what this shows us is that the stories in the Bible and in some of the later traditions, including the stories of saints such as Laurentius and Christopher, share a common foundation with the ancient myths and sacred stories of other cultures around the world. For this reason, I would argue that we can still gain all the positive lessons that these stories are trying to convey to us for our lives, while at the same time, this realization should be a very decisive argument against some of the more negative and even objectionable practices that literalist Christianity has adopted due to the teaching that its stories are somehow the only ones that are true and the only ones that are supposedly literal. They're not literal. But that, of course, does not mean that they have nothing to teach us. On the contrary, I'm absolutely convinced that the ancient myths given to humanity and preserved in the ancient scriptures and sacred traditions of the world have profound, important wisdom to convey to us, with applications for our lives in this modern age, right now, and even in this very moment where we are, and that, in fact, we need them now more than ever. So Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for your feedback and your questions and suggestions, and thank you to @Janaka for today's subject on the legend of Saint Christopher.